Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Price, and today we're going to be talking about Marcion's Jesus. So, Dr. Price, for those that may not be familiar with Marcion's view, could you tell us how did Marcion view Jesus?
Well, he seems to have, there's some debate about this, but it's been commonly thought that since his story of Jesus didn't have any nativity, but rather it was apparently closer to Luke, though without subsequent additions, and it began in our Luke chapter 4, where Jesus goes down to the Capernaum synagogue. Was it down to the synagogue, and and teaches in there and gets into big trouble. And they're so incensed at what he says, which is basically, yeah, I know you're probably expecting me to do miracles and healings here, but that's not the way it works. Elijah and Elisha never healed any fellow Israelites, only foreigners. Well, this really gets them stirred up, and they form a lynch mob and drag Jesus to the brow of the precipice of the hill that their village is built on, something that creates a bit of a problem since Nazareth, whenever it was actually started, was on a plane apparently. But they want to throw him over and kill him, but without any explanation, the text says he just passed among them and escaped. Well, how would he have done that? Well, okay, these two things together implied that Marcion pictured Jesus in some sort of docetic form, that is, an apparent flesh and blood body, from the Greek word dokeo, to seem or to appear. And there were early Christians that for sure thought this. I mean, some texts like the preaching of John, which is part of the Acts of John, it makes it absolutely clear that Jesus could change the density of his body at will. Your hand reaching out to touch him might pass through like he was made of smoke, or it might bounce off as if it were made of steel. And of course, that means he has no real ordinary human body, so no incarnation. And yet, so how does that fit those two passages? Well, the one that says he came down, Marcion apparently took to mean that he descended from heaven in the visible form of an adult, that there was never any nativity, which is why in that gospel there wasn't one. Even Hans Conzelmann, who did not hold any truck with Gnosticism and so forth, he thought that the first couple of chapters of Luke were not original to the gospel, just on internal stylistic grounds and so on. Well, yeah, it lacked it, Marcion said, because there wasn't any nativity, because there was no childbirth. This is just an inch away from Buddhist stories, where there is what some call a phantom birth. And that the Buddha is no sooner born than he gets up and walks and makes some kind of a big statement. In one version, it's, I am supreme in this world. This is my last incarnation. In another one, he walks a few steps in all four cardinal directions and makes some sort of statement about the Dharma. Well, obviously, and he seems to grow up, right, through the years, but it's all kind of a charade. But in Marcion's case, it's assumed he just had Jesus drift down out of the sky. I think that something similar is assumed in one part of the ascension of Isaiah, where Isaiah sees prophetically Jesus descending through the various celestial spheres that are concentric around the earth. And in each sphere, he assumes the physical mode of the existence of the angels and whatever else there are on each sphere so that they don't see him coming. If they see him, they oh yeah, he's just another angel like us or whatever. And then he appears on earth. I guess it doesn't explicitly say, but that kind of implies to me that whoever wrote that pictured Jesus just appearing as if he had beamed down, as we say. So if that's what Marcion meant, that's one thing that would imply Docetism. Well, what about the rejection and the attempted lynching in the synagogue? Well, how did he get through that throng of people who wanted to kill him? Well, the implication is that he changed his density again. He drifted through the crowd who were flesh and blood and presented no opposition to him. I mean, they would have had they been able to, but if they tried to grab him, there was nothing to grab hold of. And I have to admit, if it doesn't mean that, I'm not sure what it does mean. Does it mean that Jesus just looked authoritative or said, "Now, aren't you ashamed of yourself?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess so." Like the whoever is without sin, let him cast the first stone. That just doesn't seem to fit here. So these two things would imply right at the outset that Marcion had a kind of a Docetist view. Now, that seems perhaps to be contradicted at the other end of the gospel, where Jesus is crucified. And according to Marcionite theology, he did suffer and die on the cross. So, how could he do that? Well, it doesn't explicitly say, but it seems to me what we're dealing with there is something like what, centuries later, I believe it was Caspar Schwenkfeld, one of the radical reformers, who said that, yeah, Jesus did have a solid body of flesh, but where did he get it? It was made of celestial substance of some kind. This is one reason Martin Luther thought he was just a kook and wanted nothing to do with him. But I think that actually is a good question, because if you say, where did the zygote come from? If you believe there was the miraculous conception, was it created by God? Wait a second. The begotten, not created. I mean, that really gets you into weird questions. Ed Suominen and I try to reason that one out in a book we collaborated on called Evolving Out of Eden. But it's not easy to do. And apparently Schwenkfeld thought that. And my guess is that must be something like what Marcion had in mind. He had a body. He could assume solidity with it, but he had to die on the cross, Marcion thought, to ransom the creatures of the Old Testament God, Jehovah, who had created the world, created humanity, and given the law through Moses, but unfortunately was not the God of love, who was Jesus' Father. And so Jesus wanted to free the poor creatures of the Creator, but to do so, he had to give his life as a kind of a hostage ransom. Now, that doesn't completely make sense to me, but on the other hand, that is about the only theory I've ever heard that makes some sense of saying, well, he died to redeem people, to ransom people. That implies you're paying as for the manumission of slaves. Who's he paying? Well, this makes a bit of sense to me. So he had a some sort of a material body when he needed one. But otherwise did not. So that is in the idea of shape shifting and changing one's density is And if you want a modern version of it, the only place you'd find it would be in comics and movies, like the Vision in the Avengers. He changes his density because he's some sort of super advanced uh, android. Or the Martian Manhunter in DC Comics. He can change his density at will. He's either a ghost or completely solid. Well, as with many items in comics and superhero movies, they've taken bits of ancient mythology that are no longer really part of the theology of these religions, but they've kind of stuck around in the popular conscience. And I think that probably is a good explanation for what Marcion thought. Jesus wasn't merely a ghost, but he was a shapeshifter, like the gods of Greek mythology. Like Zeus and Apollo and others had sex with mortal women, like the sons of God in Genesis 6. Well, you can't really do that apparently without a body. But they could also, appear and disappear and rise into heaven. So, it's. I think you find that in the Old Testament with theophanies. And it could be that more people than Marcion understood Jesus that way. As Margaret Barker says, that they viewed Jesus as a theophany of Yahweh, that he wasn't the son of Yahweh, he was Yahweh, and that he was appearing. Well, look at those stories where the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar or Gideon or whoever else. They don't seem to be flesh and blood. And that's why they can't or don't eat, etc. Well, if you view Jesus as one of these theophanies, I think the Christology most consistent with that would be Docetism. And that's not to say only if you had a Jewish understanding of Jesus that you would, but it's certainly on display there and in ancient Greece, and so it's not an alien concept to the ancient world we're talking about. So I think that's probably what Marcion thought. And of course, we're just inferring this from scraps and hints, right? There's no way to be sure about it at all. But that's the way it seems to me that the scant evidence points.
Where do you think that Marcion heard of Jesus from? Where do you think he got his information from?
Hard to say. He before he became Marcion, you might say, he was raised in some type of Christianity, and there's no telling where that might have been, and what sort of doctrine prevailed there. Uh, and so plus, like, was he a Gnostic? Well, that's conceivable, though not all Gnostics were Docetists. Was he an Encretite, the celibacy gospel? Well, yeah, we know he was, at least once he hung out his own shingle to start his movement. We know that he was in the anti-sex league, as George Orwell called it, and Encratites tended to be Docetists, even if they weren't Gnostic, because they felt like, well, the flesh is unclean, Galatians, I know that in my flesh dwelleth no good thing. And they felt like, what would the Son of God be doing taking on a filthy, stinking carcass? I mean, you hear the Buddhists talk down the body and what a disgusting meat sack it is. Well, yeah, that's so he might well have picked this up just from popular Christianity. And I would assume his family was some kind of a Christian. And he knew about Judaism and about Torah Christianity, right? And because he was apparently rejecting the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and rejecting any kind of Christianity that tried to harmonize Jesus with the Old Testament. So he had a range. He was sort of like Joseph Smith, I imagine. He was dissatisfied with the different versions of Christianity he heard and said, there's got to be a better understanding. And he figured it out however he did and came up with a Jesus who was some kind of docetic, um, seeming embodiment of God, whoever he would have conceived that to be. Um, he wouldn't have thought of him as Jehovah, that's for sure, right? But he would have been the divine son in some way, and that his Jesus would have opposed the Torah, didn't necessarily think it was evil, but like real dyed in the wool Gnostics did, that the Torah was given by evil angels and to succor the human race. He probably didn't go that far, but he had an almost ecumenical respect for Judaism. As he did for Catholic Christianity. He said, these things are, to some degree, really misaimed. These poor Jews and Catholics think they're worshiping the ultimate God, but the God who gave the Torah is not he's the creator, yes, but there is a higher God, and that's who Jesus came to reveal. And So he somehow decided that just as Joseph Smith did, and Smith had a very different God concept too. He said, this makes more sense. This seems to fit with the Bible better. And of course, that's what all sectarian founders do. They take a second look at the Bible, and they've got their eyes open for anomalies, things that don't seem to fit the paradigm of Christianity as they were taught it. That's why Mormons love Margaret Barker, and rightly so, because she was able to take off the blinders and spot all these fascinating indications that biblical religion was much different than the way we learn it. And spontaneously, she happened to agree with a number of points the Mormons made. Well, they love her, and I can see why. So do I. But that's what he did, like Joseph Smith and Charles Taze Russell and Martin Luther, right? And what he came up with is biblical. It's not the only biblical thing, right? I'm always on the soapbox saying that there's not one uniform set of beliefs, even within the New Testament, even within the Gospels. You got different viewpoints from different writers, and they clash. And we have simply learned not to see the ones that clash with our church's tradition. But he somehow did, and came up with this distinctive view of Jesus vis-a-vis the flesh, vis-a-vis Jehovah, and vis-a-vis the Torah. And it caught on like gangbusters all over the Mediterranean.
I have a couple of super chat questions. Brave New History, thank you for your super chat. What are the reasons people think Marcion's gospel could be a proto Mark when it's so Lucan? Thoughts on Marcion as the first gospel versus redacted Luke?
Well, there are some pretty strong thought provokers in Mark that sound a lot like Marcionism. Now, the lamest one, and I admit this doesn't mean much, is it possible that since Marcion or Marcion means little Mark, it's a diminutive of that, that preserves some memory that this was the actual Gospel of Marcion. Again, that's not all that compelling, but it is kind of interesting in light of something else. The way the apostles or the disciples are depicted in Mark is pretty rough. Mark, whoever he was, really manhandles him. Uh, um, oh boy, what's his name? Theodore J. Whedon, in his great book, Mark traditions in conflict from, I think, 1971 or something. He's a Lutheran, by the way. He said, "Have you noticed that the disciples are always in Mark depicted as a bunch of idiots and traitors? They never show up except to get things wrong." Right? Who do you say that I am? And good old Peter, for a split second, basks in Jesus's approval. He says, "Oh, you're the Christ." And then Jesus says, "Okay, now don't tell anybody." And in fact, from now on, you want to know that the Son of Man has to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. They're going to beat the hell out of him, mock him, crucify him, and then he'll rise from the dead. And Peter rebukes him. And in Matthew, it kind of gets even worse. You know, God forbid, Lord, this must never happen to you. But nonetheless, Jesus rebukes him. And get behind me, Satan. You're not tuned in with God. You're thinking like mere humans do. And anytime anything comes up, Peter's, he's expecting to get an A, but he gets an F. Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother if he sins against me? How about 7 times a day? That's pretty big. And Jesus says, "No, no, no. How about 70 times 7?" Actually, that one may be in Matthew, I forget. But there's a number of things like this where, "Oh, Lord, if they arrest you, I will go to my death to defend you." Oh, you will? Let's wait and see. And again and again, he just screws up and never really gets anything right. And then what happens when Jesus is arrested? Zoom, away all of them go to the four winds. And then there's Peter, who denies Jesus 3 times. It's like he just can't wait for the next opportunity to say, "I never heard of this guy." And then there's Judas, right, who actually sells him out. And whoa, isn't there a point in Mark where they're all one big happy family again? And Jesus says, "Well, I know it's kind of tough. I forgive you." No, no, there's something like that in John 21, an addition to that gospel, but not in Mark. Why? Or how about the thing where James and John say, "Hey, Master, you'll be happy to know that we saw some guy exorcising demons invoking your name." Well, naturally, we told him to cut it out because he's working our side of the street. We got Jesus trademarked. And he says, "You did what?" Look, somebody doing a miracle in my name is not going to turn against me. We need all the friends we can get, for Pete's sake. Well, there is this unremitting negativity. And what was it that they did wrong? There's this exorcist who is doing what you're telling us to do. But since he wasn't one of the 12, we told him to cease and desist. Who could that be? Why is that story even in there? Well, I think it's because he is sort of winking and defending Paul. And so there's this idea that, well, there might be somebody who knows what's going on with Jesus, but it isn't these idiots. Uh, that's that's really striking. Here is a gospel that knows about the 12 disciples, but puts them in an unremittingly bad light. Now, who else do we know of in early Christianity that might have wanted to do that? No, let's see. Would it be Tertullian? Would it be Irenaeus or Polycarp? No, they all loved the disciples, practically worshipped the apostles. But there is that guy Marcion over in Pontus that says, "Look, these dullards, never understood Jesus. And what was Jesus' reaction? Says, how long am I going to have to be with you? And that kind of sounds like Marcionite stuff. Of course, there's stuff in other gospels too that sounds like it, like in Matthew and Luke, where Jesus says, Father, I bless you, Lord of heaven and earth. You have revealed these things unto babes, but hidden them from the so-called wise. And he says, no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son is willing to reveal him. Nobody knows the Father. What about Moses and Isaiah and Joshua and all these people? They didn't know the Father. Well, not if the Father of Jesus was not that God. That sounds kind of Marcionite also. And so it seems to me you would almost naturally have to wonder, is Mark the Gospel of Marcion? And I know some people have thought that. I believe um, another Jesus Seminar colleague of mine, um, who, though older, was not as senile as I am at this moment. I'll think of it later. But that's not impossible. Now, he thought that Mark had, there are all these different theories of synoptic relations, how Matthew, Mark, and Luke relate to one another. There's some kind of interdependence. Well, probably the least favored, but it does have its partisans, is the theory that Matthew and Luke were already written, and Mark liked them both, but thought, boy, there's some areas where they really don't agree, like the Nativity, the Sermon on the Mount. It's in two different forms. The resurrection appearances. I don't know which to pick.
You talk
I
about
tell you
the
what, I'm just going to cut the stuff out where they don't agree.
you talk
Well,
about the Grisback hypothesis.
I think so. I
Yeah, but the idea that Mark is harmonizing Matthew and Luke, but where he cannot, he ignores.
Yeah. And whoa, geez, which the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, which one should I use? That forget it, cutting room floor. I can't imagine that's true, but it makes a kind of sense. It's certainly possible, but that's you might say Marcion was the guy who did that, if that's what happened. With the reasons to think that Marcion's gospel was Mark, I think it's more complicated than that. And I like very much the Marcus Vincent theory that Marcion did write his own gospel, compiling it from rewrites of Old Testament stories from the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. And he made stories originally about Elijah, Elisha, Moses, Joshua, and David, etc., into stories about Jesus with greater or lesser alterations in plot and the order of events. And that the reason he did it was he did not want to just claim the Jewish scripture as Christian, because that wouldn't fit his Christology, right? He couldn't reject the Old Testament if he thought Jesus had accepted it. But he liked a lot of the stuff. How could you not? And so he rewrote it as being about Jesus. Kind of the way the Quran has a few biblical stories retold to make them sound more like Muhammad. So he seems to have created the Jesus of the Gospels. Now, that doesn't tell you whether there was a historical Jesus at the root of the thing. You could argue that different ways. It's a distinct idea. But according to Vincent's view, Marcion did put together a basic gospel, and he passed out copies to his students. They had seminars, kind of like we do today in grad school. And these guys loved it. And they said, boy, this is hot stuff. We can't keep it to ourselves. And so they started making copies and saying, hey, take a look at this. And while you're at it, why don't you make a copy for somebody else? So it starts circulating. And Marcion, it's kind of like in that story of James and John. Marcion's students come up to him and say, hey, Dr. Marcion, you're really going to pat us on the head. We've been sending copies out. He says, what? And it wasn't ready for publication yet. And so, there's apparently neglected ancient remarks that imply this, that Vincent's working from. And he said, well, the cat's out of the bag, but let me come up with a definitive version and publish that. And so he took what he had originally written and decided to use some of the other stuff that people had added. And this became the Matthew, Mark, and Luke were those earlier supplemented versions. And when he wrote the one that Marcionites en masse used in their New Testament, he had shaved down some of the additions, added others, so that his looks most like an early version of Luke.
Do you think that M and L, the Matthew Luke special sources, were written around the same time as Marcion, or maybe earlier than Marcion?
Well, I would guess, just for the simplicity of the theory, that if Marcus Vincent is right, M and L are prime examples of stuff that these others added. And which is why he cuts out anything that had Jesus as champion of the Torah. And so I'm assuming he cut not what, well, now this would not be much different from the usual view that Matthew and Luke each used Mark and added material to it. And that Marcion had Luke at least and decided to cut material out of that. Well, all you would need to say is that the Luke he used was already a kind of a supplemented version of his draft gospel that someone else had made and padded. He just removed the padding and may have added other stuff or some bits here and there. But like if he was working for Matthew, it's no accident that the Marcionite gospel did not have Jesus say, don't believe that I came to abolish the law and the prophets. And anybody that says I did, they're going to be the least in the kingdom of heaven. Well, of course, that's directly anti-Marcionite. Paul doesn't talk about abolishing the law and the prophets. He doesn't go that far. But that is saying no more Jewish scripture. And who could he be talking about? So it's no accident you don't have anything like that in, or how about the thing about the garments, the wine and the wineskins. All three synoptics have some version of that, where Jesus is apparently saying he's defending his practice of leaving behind old Jewish customs of penitence to prepare for the coming of the kingdom of God. And Jesus says something new has happened. That's why we don't do the old customs. And they, why? And he says, well, just imagine somebody's emptied an old leather wineskin. It's been used a bunch of times. It's just, the seams are barely hanging together. Who would put in new wine? that hasn't yet fermented, because as it ferments, it expands, and it's got no place to expand if it's old and worn out. It's already stretched as much as it possibly can. So you put the new wine in there, kaboom! Eventually, you're going to lose the skins and the wine. And what does Luke add to that? But nobody who's familiar with old wine even wants to drink the new. He says, "Oh, the old stuff is vintage." Now that's anti-Marcionite in Luke. Well, it's not in the Marcionite gospel. Those are just a couple of examples, but it is a complicated theory, but it makes a lot of sense to me, because any way you cut it, a real simple solution just is not going to cover enough of the bases.
Let's take a look at the next super chat. Crossover Maniac, thank you for your super chat. Is there any writing that indicates or at least hints that Marcion believed in a purely celestial Jesus who was slain in the heavens?
I don't know of one that says that the crucifixion was in the heavens, though that wouldn't be inconsistent, except that he's pretty clear that Jesus did come to earth, and appeared to be the kind of person you could run out of town or throw off the cliff. So I don't think he could be counted in that group, the celestial crucifixion. Though that, I think, as you probably know, I think that is a very viable view. But even a Docetist wouldn't necessarily accept that. In fact, you could see straight Docetism as a kind of a compromised position between somebody that believed Jesus had been on earth, but in a phantom holographic form. And well, that would be classic Docetism, right? The compromise would be between those who believed in an incarnation, that yes, he took on a human body and walked around on earth and ate and drank and suffered. Okay, there's that. But then there's the idea that, oh no, he never came to earth. People had visions of him occasionally, but he was never on earth. And even the crucifixion happened in heaven. How would this be a compromise? Well, if you said, all right, he was seen on earth, maybe even for 3 years, maybe even longer, but he wasn't actually there. He didn't leave any footprints. It was like seeing a ghost the whole darn time, as in the preaching of John. So that, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the origin of what we usually think of as Docetism, and it would be trying to reconcile the idea that Jesus never came to earth and there was a celestial crucifixion with the notion that yes, he did, and he was crucified by the Romans.
This is interesting because earlier today I did an interview with Professor Marcus Vincent. And, we were talking about the ascension of Isaiah, and he was telling me that in none of the manuscripts of the ascension of Isaiah does Jesus die in heaven. He's always dies on earth.
Yeah, I don't understand where the Richard Carrier and others are getting that.
Right.
I mean, I think there are things that suggest that, like in the book of Revelation, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And in Revelation also, you have Jesus as the lamb who was slain, and he's in heaven. I mean, all of that stuff seems to me to hint at a celestial crucifixion. Everything else happens in heaven in there. So who knows? But I don't see it in the ascension of Isaiah. Maybe I'm just, I need even more new glasses.
Trevorn, right? Excuse me. Thank you for your super chat. What would you say about Jesus' life from a historical perspective that really happened in reality, and is it possible to separate it from fiction?
Well, I put a good bit of stock in the zealot hypothesis of SGF Brandon, Robert Eisler, Hermann Reimarus, and others who said that Jesus was certainly a religious teacher, but so was Judas of Galilee and other people who were sword wielding rebels against Rome, trying to bring in the kingdom of God, which, as it says in the Gospels, advances by violence, and violent men take it by force. That these scholars said that there are telltale hints in the Gospels, especially the story of the cleansing of the temple, that would imply, yeah, they've tried to cover it up after the crucifixion of Jesus as a rebel against Rome in order to avoid further suspicion of Rome toward their sect, which has now renounced revolution. But there were original religious ideals, and they're sticking to those. They just said, well, I guess we're a little premature on trying to establish it ourselves. I mean, that's not unusual. I think a lot of that theory, and my view is that if there was a historical Jesus, that's almost got to be him. Whether there was or not, I don't know, because again, the evidence is kind of fragmentary and could be taken different ways. But if there was a historical Jesus, my money's on him.
Do you think that Marcion had a lot of different divisions in his community? Because I know that some people classify Marcion as a Gnostic, but we also have other texts that tells us that he had a he got into an argument with Apelles, who used to be one of his closest followers, and they broke off from one another.
Yeah, and like I believe it's the, I hope I got the date right, the 6th century Armenian church historian Esnik, who said that there was a secret gnosis that the Marcionites reserved for the advanced initiates. Well, if that's the case, then I think it's fair to say Marcionism was a Gnostic type of Christianity, but we're not sure what it would have been. We do, however, know that there was a two-tiered membership, kind of like what it says in First Corinthians, that there Paul says he, or whoever says he wishes he could teach wisdom to everybody there at Corinth, but unfortunately he can't because some of them are not mature enough. It's only among the teleoi, the perfect, the initiates, that says the really surprising stuff about how Christ was put to death by the archons of this age and so on. And so he says, but the rest of you, I can't communicate on that level. These are spiritual truths to be spoken in spiritual terms to those who possess the spirit. I wish I could talk to all of you that way, but some of you really still seem to be carnal. Um, well, that's the same sort of thing Marcion and the Valentinians said, that not everybody's on the same level, but you don't just want to say to the ones who aren't really totally with it, oh, you can go to hell, who needs you? No, you can't do that. There's got to be some provision made for them, and maybe they'll come along. And when they do, they can be fully initiated and told. I mean, that's the whole idea of catechism, right? Even though it seems no longer to have any real hidden wisdom. But catechism says, oh, you want to be a Christian? You were raised a Christian, whatever. Fine, you're welcome here. But we think you should really know what Christianity is. So why don't you come to catechism class? In fact, I did one of those when I was a pastor. There were a couple of I think junior high age students, and I said, look, I am not telling you what to believe, but I do think you ought to understand your religious heritage, and then it's up to you. Well, yeah, it's a good idea that people be literate about their religion, believe in it or not. Well, these Gnostics and Marcionites did that, and there were certain behavioral things, like if you were initiated into the deep things of God, right? Then Marcionites would say, well, that's it, no marriage anymore. You're not at that level. Well, look, don't get divorced. Stay as you are, but in the advanced program, all right, things will change. So in that sense, that two-tiered thing, it's kind of like Valentinianism. There are the pneumatics, the spiritual ones, the psychics or psychikoi, the natural ones, and then unfortunately the sarkics, the carnal ones, who just haven't got a clue. They're not interested in us, and we're not interested in them. But those top two, yeah, why not? Provision has to be made for them. They didn't want to be like the Sanhedrin, right? This is such a great line in the Gospel of John. They're laughing off the possibility that Jesus could be the Messiah, and they said, "But as for this multitude that knoweth not the law, they're accursed." Like, that is just the attitude you don't want to have if you're some kind of intellectual or expert about this stuff. No, you should be a good bodhisattva and put yourself at the service of such people. But nonetheless, you can have a kind of compassionate Gnosticism that way, and the Marcionites may have. Did they get into all kinds of weird stuff about celestial emanations and the fallen Sophia? Well, we don't know. It's possible. But the dualism they had, the simple fact that there is a creator God, but he's not the God of Jesus, that's a separate God, and we're going with him. That's got the same basic architecture, but it's much simpler than any form of Gnosticism proper.
Do you think the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke could go back to potentially genealogies that predate Marcion or even Jesus being the son of David? Or do you think those are reactions against Marcion to remove the idea that Jesus came from heaven down and had no earthly parents?
Could be. It's apologetics in any case, because it would make just as much sense to me to say that these address the question of what did Jesus have proper messianic credentials that would like assume that he was a flesh and blood person born the usual way. And But was he descended from David? Not everybody thought the Messiah had to be, right, because some of the Hasmonean kings were basically considered messiahs, even though they didn't fulfill the old Davidic prophecy, right? But what were you going to do? In fact, you had guys that were Jewish kings who were Levites, not Judeans. And so they had to come up with some way of saying, yeah, I know, but he is the Messiah, old Hyrcanus over here, or whatever. Um, or You might be a Galilean Christian, and you're thinking back to the Old Testament where Rehoboam said the northern tribes sent an embassy to him and said, "Your dad Solomon was a rough customer. He's really an oppressor. We want you to ease up. If you do, we'll stick with you. But if you don't, we've had enough. We're leaving." And he asked his advisors, "Oh, what should I do?" And some of them said, "Well, there's no reason not to accede to their demands. You'll get them grateful to you for that." But the others said, "Oh no, you don't want to appear weak. You tighten the screws even more." Well, the idiot did that, and they said, "Okay, that's it. We told you what would happen." They said, "To your tents, O Israel. We have no inheritance in the house of David." And that was it. You got Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And as a result of that, you had Samaritans, and I'm sure Galileans who were in what used to be northern Israel, who said, "Oh, you Jews are waiting for the Messiah. You mean another David?" Look, we don't want anything to do with them. But we do have hope for the future. We believe that another Moses, or Moses himself, or maybe Joshua, is going to come and be a teacher, or a Messiah ben Joseph, and one of our guys. He's on the home team. And if you're dealing with any of those ideas from the north, you were interested in Jesus, you would have a vested interest in saying, well, he is the Christ, but he's not Davidic. And in fact, there is a passage that says that, right? Where Jesus says, you ever wonder why the scribes say the Messiah has to be descended from David? David wrote Psalm 110, didn't they? Of course, he didn't, but that's what they thought. And in it, he says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Psalm 2, right? Or is it Psalm 110? I get them mixed up. They're both coronation psalms. Anyway, he says, now you tell me if the Lord is David and he's talking to the Messiah and he's calling him my Lord, because he wrote the poem. How's that possible? We Jews don't talk like that. We have filial piety. I would never, I don't care who I'm talking to, if I could not call my descendant my Lord, even if he was king and I'm not. Right. And so he said, you see, it can't be so. Mark just goes right past that. He doesn't seem to realize there's a problem. He's just wanting to show Jesus silencing his critics. He got out of that one again. But who would have said that? Well, somebody that thought Jesus was the Messiah, but he wasn't Davidic. And so both the Matthean and Lucan genealogies are independent attempts to refute that. Oh, no, you don't. The Messiah does have to be Davidic, and Jesus was. And here's how he was. And they did their best to try to reconstruct what they thought had to be the linkage. I mean, I'm not going to say they were making it up. That's not a sucker, the idiots. There's no reason to think that. I mean, even modern genealogists have to make a couple of guesses here and there, right? Well, I think this guy was one of your ancestors, and let's assume he was, and that means you're also related to this one and that one, so I think that there is something going on there. They're trying to prove something, and the fact that they contradict one another shows that neither one has attained the goal. But it could work just as well for Docetism, where he has no possible genealogy.
Let's get to the next super chat. Michael Allen, thank you for your super chat. Does Dr. Bob have a top 5 list of books he recommends? Maybe even his own for a former evangelical who wants to investigate biblical criticism.
Well, Earl Doherty's books are great. The Jesus Puzzle, and a big augmented version of that, a later edition called Jesus, Neither God Nor Man. I think he's just got great insight into the text. Of my books, I would recommend Beyond Born Again, The Case Against the Case for Christ, and The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and also maybe Merely Christianity. Those are different. I try not to be nasty. I try to make it clear I do not hate Christianity or Jesus or the Gospels, but the bottom line is you can't cheat in defending them. And I think a Christian faith based on deceptions, even unwitting ones, is not worth believing in. So take a second look. So I'd say Earl's The Jesus Puzzle, my Beyond Born Again, The Case Against the Case for Christ, Merely Christianity, and did I already say The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man? Yeah, I think any of those you would enjoy, and they're thought provoking, and I think they're friendly toward the reader. I don't want to antagonize people.
All right, let's get to the next one. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. In Paradise Lost, the rebellion in heaven occurred when Adam and Eve fell. This is clear hermetic influence, a back and forth reflection between realms. Logically, the passion would affect the world above.
Yeah, it does in Hebrews, which is very interesting and unique in some ways. Uh, Jesus does his saving work in the heavenly tabernacle. In fact, as Earl Doherty delights to point out, it actually says if he were on earth, he couldn't serve as a priest, but he as a priest on the order of Melchizedek, he can present his own blood as an earthly Levitical priest would present the blood offering of a sacrificed animal to atone for sins. And so there, and also the idea that he has taken away the temple veil. And what was that, right? Well, Josephus describes it as this huge ornate curtain that with golden thread reproduced the stars of the night sky as a way of saying when the priest goes through this curtain on the Day of Atonement, it's like he's going into heaven where God is seated on the throne of the Ark of the Covenant. And it's also almost irresistible to think that's what's going on in the Gospels when the temple curtain is ripped down the middle at the time of the crucifixion. Is it saying Jesus has, or as the old Christmas song says, he hath opened heaven's door, and that man may live forevermore. So yeah, it definitely has to do with this. And the cross, what would Joseph Campbell say? It's the axis mundi that connects heaven and earth. So yeah, I think very definitely you've got the that kind of mystical as above, so below thing.
All right, next one. Dan Safford, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Bob reading Badoon's book on Marcion. What do you think of it?
I've only sampled that one yet, but I think he's great, so I'm sure it's a real good one. There's some place I looked up to see if he had commented on my version of the Gospel of Marcion, and he didn't agree with me. But I'm sure he's right and I'm wrong. But he's terrific. I love his book, Truth in Translation, and I'm eager to get to this one. He's really terrific.
Dr. Bob, why is it that sometimes the the reconstructions of the Gospel of Marcion are much longer and sometimes they're much shorter? They're shorter. What's the deal with that?
I don't know because we're all working with the same lists of alterations that Justin Martyr and Tertullian and I guess others give us because they didn't preserve a copy of it as far as we know. I hope they discover one, but there are places where these apologists and church fathers are saying, here's what Marcion did to the text. He doesn't have this passage. He doesn't have that one. He must have gotten rid of this one because it doesn't agree with him. And here he has a shorter version and so on. And they go to such lengths that you can pretty much get an idea of how his gospel read. And it's just that there's room for saying they must not have looked at every instance. They might have figured they were beaten it to death, or they may have been working from redacted copies of Marcion's gospel, because just as, according to Marcus Vincent, uh, there were pre-publication copies that were heavily edited, adding and probably subtracting stuff, and that Marcion then looked at those and brought them into play when he did his own revision of his gospel. There must have been Marcionites that felt free afterward to do this and that, to the gospel. So I've actually come to the point where I try to remember to say the Marcionite gospel, because I'm not sure what we're reading is what Marcion himself put together. What a mess. But that's the only thing I can think of. That's a real good question.
Yeah, because one reconstruction that I looked at is like, I think it's like 10 to 15 times longer than the,
Whoa.
like it then, and it's not small, it's huge. And I'm like, well, why is that the case? And so that's just something that's why I brought it up.
Wow. Yeah, I got to look into that. Sheesh. I had no idea because I've read the lists of supposed omissions Marcion made and worked from that. But that surprises me.
Let's take a look at this super chat. Somnium, Somniumus Dreaming. I hope I pronounced that correct. Thank you for your super chat. I don't know enough to ask a pertinent question, but thank you both for helping educate me.
It's a
Thank you for
pleasure. And I always contrast doing things like this in the Bible Geek with my years of experience of classroom teaching, where you knew most of the people didn't want to be there and weren't going to remember anything I said. It's like Jesus says in Superstar, my name will mean nothing 10 minutes after I'm dead. Well, in this case, 10 minutes after the exam, if that. It is so much better to have interested, inquiring minds like yourself.
So, do you think that when you look at the Gospel of Marcion, does it remind you of both Mark and Luke simultaneously?
Well, yeah, because it sort of makes clearer what certain passages in these canonical gospels might originally have meant. That they're not really that puzzling anymore. Like in light of Marcion, when you read in the Gospel of John in the beginning, no one has ever seen God, but the only begotten Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. You think, wait a second, what are you talking about? Again, like Moses never saw God? Well, if you thought that the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy was correct, you'd never say that. Or the thing with Matthew 5, 17 through 19. Don't go thinking I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. You mean the whole scripture? That never occurred to me for decades, but suddenly I realized he's not just talking about the Torah. This is the whole darn thing. Or no one knows the Father, etc. Right? There are things like this. Once you know about Marcion, you think, son of a gun, that's what they're talking about. So there are, or the thing, why is Mark so negative about the disciples? Well, if you know about Marcion, you begin to think, oh, maybe that's why. So it really throws a new light on a lot of things.
Do some scholars that look at some of the quotes of the Gospel of Marcion from certain sources, like I know there's some, the reconstruction I saw frequently cited Epiphanius as Panorion, frequently to reconstruct the Gospel of Marcion.
Say that again.
In the reconstruction that I saw, it cited the Panorion from Epiphanius
Yeah.
often.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the Epiphany at first. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. Yeah, the Epiphanius' Panorion was frequently cited to reconstruct that particular the Gospel of Marcion, but in the particular reconstruction that I had observed, that I had seen.
Well, I'm sure that the various checklists that we have don't catch all of the same instances, and that may be because they weren't all the same text, and that just as they said Marcion had added to the Gospels, which don't really think he did. He didn't cut stuff out, in my opinion. In the same way, people may have may have manhandled his gospel, or they might have been reading versions that had been harmonized with the usual canonical gospels. It may be that somebody had thought, oh, this copy of Luke is missing the thing about the new wine. Well, let me put it in. Must be a scribe goofed. So, I mean, that could account for a bunch of the what would Westcott and Hort say, the non-interpolations.
We got a super chat here, Paul Kickling. Thank you for your super chat. Dr. Price, I don't know if you're familiar with Ludwig Wittgenstein. Do you think all of these disparages of early Christian interpreters? Next super chat. I don't see the next super chat yet, so Dr. Bob, why don't you go ahead and answer that while we wait for his next super chat whenever that comes out.
Well, I'm somewhat familiar with Wittgenstein. I haven't read nearly enough, but I've been influenced by certain insights he has, and the language game idea. That's a very interesting way of dealing with religious language. That it has certain functions that are distorted if you take it as religious language as factual language. There's a philosopher of religion who is a Wittgensteinian, D.Z. Phillips, who's written a bunch of really interesting books on this. And he has one, I think, called The Concept of Prayer. And he says, to put it in my terms, prayer may not be as ridiculous as its critics charge. Like, do people that pray really think they are going to twist God's arm or send him a petition that will compel or convince him to change his plans? Well, it looks like that on the surface, but on the other hand, they are asking, not telling. The mere fact that prayer assumes that form implies they don't think they're ordering God around. And especially since they usually say, thy will be done, they're kind of doing what Meister Eckhart said. The only prayer you ought to pray is, thy will be done. You know better than I do, God, but I am making my concern known to you. Well, and he took various things, various instances where, or like denials. I love this one. He said, if somebody were to come up to me and say, Wittgenstein, do you think the end of the world is at hand? The second coming, Armageddon. He said, well, I could answer that in a couple of ways if I just said, no, I don't. Would that mean, like, what kind of answer was the guy asking for? Does he mean, do you think it's at hand or maybe a couple of months away? And or the answer Wittgenstein said he would give is, look, I'm sorry, I don't even see things in those terms. I'm not in the sphere of discourse you are. That's pretty interesting to me. And he had this aphoristic style where he would just hit you with these little insights. You didn't need a whole system, and he wasn't a systematizing philosopher, but I think there's a lot more to be mined from Wittgenstein. If you've got the other half of this, guess I'm done.
Yeah, it's up now. He says it's all language, meaning problems, and really none of their beliefs are actual disagreements, just in their minds, like chasing ghosts.
Well, the example I gave about your belief that that the end of the world is or is not coming really depends on what community of interpreters you're in, what your assumptions, your paradigms are. And for instance, once I was having lunch with a woman that rented space in our church for New Age services she had. This woman was very sharp. And she was like claimed to be a kind of a shaman, which seems eccentric and all that, but she would, had her head on straight. But I found I couldn't find a way to answer her meaningfully, because she would ask all these things that presupposed a completely different worldview, and there was just no way to cross over into her interpretive scheme of belief about the world. And I think that's often the case, that you just can't have communication, because it's as if you're speaking German and I'm speaking Mandarin. What we say has meaning to us, but not to somebody who's not clued in. And I think that's in a sense what Wittgenstein is talking about. Let me just give you one more example that Phillips gives. Uh, People claim to believe they're going to heaven when they die, and they have some vague idea, at least, of what it's going to be like. Well, do they really believe what it sounds like they believe? And Phillips gave the Wittgensteinian example of a Viking warrior on the battlefield who gets conked on his helmet and passes out. Well, an unknown time later, he wakes up and he's being guided to a chair at a huge banqueting table. And the place he's in has these vast, vaulted, polished granite or marble, stone masonry and stuff in it, and the food is great. There's heaps of it, well cooked, and so forth, and everybody is hoisting the jack of ale and singing and having a high old time. And he thinks, did I get killed in battle and I'm now in Valhalla, the Hall of Heroes? And he looks around him and thinks, this, I've never seen a place this spiffy, this terrific. Whenever I hear about this, whenever I think about this story, I think of the time I went to West Point with a bunch of people from church, and we ate in this huge, magnificent dining hall. Well, what would it take? Wouldn't the Viking have to say, well, what did I expect? Is this really as spectacular as I thought it would be? Well, how much more spectacular would it have to be to count as such? But this is pretty darn impressive, though. And Phillips says you have to ask yourself, what was it you imagined? Probably nothing you could actually see could live up to it, because there wasn't really an it. You didn't really have anything in mind. So, did you have a literal belief that you're going to go up to paradise and it's just going to be so great and all that? I don't think you did. It was vague and ghostly, like you said. It serves a certain function. To believe in this, whatever it is like what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz said. It's a way of the mind seeking refuge against certain nagging problems of injustice, ignorance, and adversity that strike everybody. And we would like to believe there's justice and order in the world, but these things make it look like there is not. Well, that's terrible. We don't want to live in such a world. So we posit an adjacent, unseen realm in which somehow all these questions will be answered. A silly example might be when fundamentalists say, well, Pastor, I don't see how this one passage fits together. They just seem to contradict. And the pastor says, well, I know what you mean. I've puzzled on that too. But when we get to heaven, they'll give us all the answers. Well, there are many. Reincarnation is like that. Yeah, life is hell now, but next time around, if I behave myself, I'll have my innings. Or resurrection from the dead. You know, it's bad now, but it'll be good then. All of these things are not really beliefs or opinions. They're just sort of soothing rationalizations to sort of cognitive teddy bears to take the sting out of life. And so it doesn't matter really how literally you take them, and you probably don't take them. What do you think is going to happen when Jesus comes back? I was ridiculing the Left Behind novels because they have Jesus coming back, and how's he going to have fellowship with all these Christians? Well, basically, he's sending out form letters with your name penciled in saying, "Oh, I love you. I died for you." Just the writer can't really picture what he thinks he has pictured all his life. And so I agree. A lot of it is a mind game. And it's wholesome, I guess. It does save people from despair and horror. But with Freud, I guess I would rather just try to brave it.
Crossover Maniac for Free Super Chat. Did Marcion reference Josephus's works?
Oh boy, I'd really have to compare what we think was in the Marcionite Gospel with the sections of Luke that seem to borrow, or the others, to borrow from Josephus. But I don't know that you would find, if we could dig up a copy of Marcion's Gospel, I don't know if you would find extra material that he added, that he and his editors had not added. But he could have originally. I mean, he could well have come up with the notion of Jesus being the one of the three who survived crucifixion by the Romans. He could be the one who borrowed the passion narrative of Jesus ben Ananias from Josephus. He could have been the one that, well, if this would have been in there, you know, the story where Jesus is at the temple when he's 12 years old, and he's the whiz kid who is dialoguing with the temple elders. I mean, that's a classic docetic kind of a story, right? He's not really a kid, he's just trapped in a kid's body, at least apparently. But I don't know, so I guess he wouldn't have used that, but that might be a good kind of example, that there are things in Luke that would make sense as Luke's borrowing, but who with Marcus Vincent's hypothesis, who would have borrowed it from Josephus? Would have been Marcion or one of his volunteer editors pirating his gospel later? I don't know.
Do you think that the Gospel of Marcion was also aware of the Q document?
Well, that's tempting to say, because he lived in Sinope, if that's how you say it, in Asia Minor, in Pontus, and so did Diogenes the Cynic, and Burton Mack and John Dominic Crossan and others are mighty impressed with the Cynic flavor of Q1, at least the hypothetical original pre-Christian, well, I should say pre-Christological version of Q, which, as Mac pointed out, can be neatly distilled into 7 topical sections, but which does not have apocalypticism or Christology in it. I find that pretty convincing. It could be that he would have had a cynic version of Q where it wasn't even attributed to Jesus. After all, as in the Gospel of Thomas, it just says, you know, he said, Jesus said, And given that the sayings of Q are simply attributed to a narrative character of Jesus, we don't really know if they originally had the name Jesus attached to them. And so it could well be that he had the Cynic Q1 would have been readily available to him.
Got another super chat. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. I just got your book on Derrida, wondering if you planning on doing a video on it on this channel. But give me a little time to read it first.
Is this preaching deconstruction? Yeah, it's got to be. I mentioned Derrida and some other things, but that's the one where I have compiled a bunch of sermons, believe it or not, that I gave that are heavily influenced by Jacques Derrida and Thomas Altizer. And I'd love to hear what you think of it. And if Jacob wouldn't scream about it, given the way I'd probably confuse the hell out of most viewers, I'd be happy to discuss deconstruction and how it applies to the Bible.
Let's get to the next one. Crossover Maniac, thank you for your super chat. Did Marcion believe Yahweh was the Demiurge?
Yeah, the Hebrew God, the creator, the lawgiver was the demiurge who made the world and dealt with Israel and so on. So very definitely.
Before Marcion, Dr. Price, do you think anyone felt similarly to him that the Jewish God was the evil demon and that Jesus came to earth to save mankind from him? Or was this or did you really think this most likely started with Marcion as his original idea?
Well, our pal David Litwa wrote this great book called The Evil Creator, which he and Marcus Vincent, I got to say, I am not worthy to lace up their sandals. These guys are incredible geniuses, and I have profited much from their books. Well, in The Evil Creator, Litwa gives evidence from Hellenistic Egypt that showed long before Marcion and even before Christianity, I believe, they thought they knew about Yahweh or Jehovah, which they abbreviated as Yahoo. What would it be? Iota, Alpha, Omega. That would be the transliterated abbreviation for Yahweh, and they knew about him and his rap sheet in the Old Testament, all the massacres and the awful judgments and so forth. And they said, now, who would this match in our mythology? Probably wouldn't have put it that way. And they said, well, he really sounds most like Set, the evil brother of Osiris. So apparently it was commonly believed by pre-Christian Egyptians who knew something about the Judaism and the Israel and the Bible and so on, that they worshipped Set. And that's quite an indictment. And so this, and Litwa shows that this was already current when you started to get Apelles and Marcion and the Gnostics bad mouthing the Creator, like in one of the Nag Hammadi texts. I think it's the Testimony of Truth. If it's not, it's The Origin of the World. I got to look that up again. It's retelling the Eden story and how God didn't want the man and the woman to have the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and but he can't stop them. And then he realizes, oh my gosh, they haven't eaten of the tree of life yet. I better get them the hell out of here before they do, because then we're really in trouble. He reviews this and says, and this is a quote, "What sort of a God is this? Is he not a malicious grudger? Well, yeah, I think the Gnostics were the only ones taking it literally, but apparently so were some Egyptians. And they said, like Dan Barker, and well, and I guess before him, um, what's this? Richard Dawkins said that the biblical God is the nastiest character in the history of world literature. Well, there is a case to be made for that, and so they already thought, oh yeah, they worship Set. They just don't call him that. Oh, oh boy. So yeah, the idea was already in the air well before these guys tried to adapt it to Christianity, right? You see, what they were doing was to say, yeah, they've got God right. But how would that work in Christianity? He couldn't have been the father of Jesus. Well, okay, he wasn't. Two different gods.
Got another super chat here. Vesper, thank you for your super chat. Does Marcion have Jesus die? Who else has him live?
Well, the he does have Jesus die. That some of the Gnostics drew a distinction that makes it hard to answer the question. Like there's in the Acts of John, and I think one of the Acts of Peter is two or three books with that title. It tells us that though Jesus was on the cross dying and his enemies are shaking their fists and mocking him and those disciples are weeping, he appears simultaneously in a cave on the Mount of Olives and summons either Peter or John, depending on which one you're reading, and says, you know, those fools over there at Golgotha think they're killing me, but in fact, I am not dead. And that lie will continue, but you know the truth. Well, what did they mean exactly? Did they mean that it was like the interpretation they give in, oh, my favorite Jesus movie by far, The Last Temptation of Christ? You know, Jesus actually seems, at least, to escape the cross, but the people gathered around the base of it still think they see him. They're still mocking him and so on, while we're witnessing Jesus and his guardian angel walking away. Now, is that what it means, that they were seeing a kind of a hallucination? I guess it could be. But I think it's more likely that what they mean is that's just my shell. That's just the body. The real me is here, the spiritual one. And so I think that's more, that kind of fits more with the Gnostic gospel kind of idea. So would you say he died or not? Well, even the Valentinians, they said that when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? What he was Who he was addressing, the Christ spirit that had entered into his body at the baptism, and that the human Jesus did die to atone for the sins of the Sukikoi, you know, the conventionally religious, and their faith would save them. But the Christ Spirit who fled, while it occupied the human Jesus as its channeler, it gave the secret teaching for the Gnostics who have no need of an atonement. They're not saved by faith, but by knowledge. So, did Jesus die or not? It's kind of a matter of semantics. And of course, if it's Jewish theology, it's Semitic semantics. Sorry about that. It's all in how you define the thing, I guess. Oh, then there's one other one. There is the as what the Schleiermacher called the shine toad, the apparent death theory, the swoon theory, that Jesus was crucified for sure, but there are hints in the text that he was let down prematurely, because when he was supposedly being given this painkiller in a hyssop sponge, which, that was a real thing, that kind of thing happened, to take the sting out of it. What they were really doing was giving him a sedative, so that it sort of put him out, and he had no visible life signs, and so he seemed to be dead in a mere 6 hours, whereas the other guys, you know. Uh, sunset came and they were still alive, because crucifixion was supposed to kill you over days. And they come back to Pilate and say, well, Jesus is dead already. And Pilate says, what? That quick? And he tells them to go check, and they do. And so then Joseph of Arimathea said, I'd be willing to dispose of the body if you'll give it to me. He said, yeah, sure, take it. And that while he was in the tomb, he revived. He came out of it. And people visiting to mourn heard some scratching and said, what the hell? Is there somebody alive in there? Pull the stone aside, son of a gun, it's Jesus. I mean, there are various pointers without getting taken all night on this. I don't think it's a far-fetched theory. Call me a nut if you want. There are hints in the gospel stories that some believe that happened, and it could have. So now, who believes that today? Is there any sect or group that does? Well, yeah, the only ones known to me, but they are the real deal, are the Ahmadiyya community of Muslims who started over in, I think, Pakistan with, well, they're named after their Messiah, Mahdi Ahmad, and he believed that's what happened, and that he was the second coming of Jesus. And there are a lot of those people. So there are, Muslims, Orthodox Muslims believe that Jesus was taken up to heaven before somebody was crucified in his place. So he didn't die in their reckoning either. So yeah, there are a lot of people that believe Jesus didn't die on the cross. I used to like to point that out to my students, and I'd say, now you can't settle a thing like this by majority vote. It doesn't really prove anything. But I just think, for perspective's sake, you ought to know that there's something like 1 billion people in the world who believe, as certainly as you believe in the resurrection, that Jesus didn't even die on the cross. And make of it what you will. But it's kind of, it makes you sit back and think again. And go, well, wait a minute. Why do I think it? That he did. What is the reasoning here? So I always like to give him the old Zen slap. Wake up.
Let's get to the next super chat. Paul Kickling, thank you for your super chat. Why would the Elohim let someone corrupted with sin, a mental virus, have immortality? That would be a bigger sin. Gnostics could be very surface level.
Well, the Gnostics didn't think that Adam and Eve were guilty of any sin. My daughter Victoria, when she was a young kid, for some reason in a class assignment, she made this little book, The Real Story of Adam and Eve. I'm really proud of her. And in it, God calls them on the carpet and said, you disobeyed me, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they say to him, look, what do you mean? We didn't have knowledge of good and evil before we ate. How were we supposed to know it was wrong to do it? Yeah, good question. So the Gnostics thought that Jehovah was trying to keep them in the dark, just like some chapters later, the Tower of Babel. They start building a tower for safety in case God floods the world again or something. And Jehovah shows up to take a look, and he says, oh my gosh, who would have thought they'd have been capable of this? If we let them go, if we gods let them go like this, soon there's nothing they're not going to be able to do. We got to put a stop to this. Hey, I got it. Let's confuse their languages so they can't understand each other. Yeah, then they'll never be able to finish this or anything else. And so they do, and they'll leave in disgust and confusion. They don't want the gods don't want human beings to have knowledge because it's a threat to them. Now, obviously, stories like this are written by the priesthood who want to keep people in the dark, right? And so they're saying, well, God really didn't want you to have knowledge either. Why don't you just leave it to us? So the Gnostics thought if anybody is the sinner here, it's God. In fact, Orthodox Judaism never saw the Eden story as the story of the fall into sin. They thought, oh no, the story about that is the sons of God corrupting the daughters of men. But this really had nothing to do with it. So I think the traditional Christian reading of this has introduced problems because they're just misreading it. But you know, to go back to the wording of your question, God didn't. If you say that Adam and Eve were corrupted by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it would make sense that God didn't want that plague to continue and would deny them access to the tree of life. Let's start over again, and hopefully this time we'll have people who will not be disobedient and learn wickedness. Though even there, I think it's misinterpreting the role of Adam and Eve and God. But if you take it that way, I see an element of consistency, but misreading.
Well, thank you for joining me, Dr. Price.
Great fun as always.
Yep. I thank everybody who super chatted their questions today, and I'll see everybody later. Thanks again, Bob.
You bet.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.